One day, she would actually be inside the farmhouse, and you could see her face looking out of the window. Another day, she would be far over to the left, with a duck in her arms. Did you see her moving in the picture, Grandmamma? Nobody did. Wherever she was, wherever outside feeding, whether feeding the ducks or inside looking out of the window, she was always motionless, just a figure painted in oils. It was all very odd, my grandmother said. Very odd indeed. And what was the most odd of all was that the years went by. She kept growing older in the picture. In 10 years, the small girl had become a young woman. In 30 years, she was middle-aged. Then, all at once, 54 years after it had all happened, she disappeared from the picture altogether. You mean she died? I said. Who knows? My grandmother said. Some very mysterious things go on in the world of witches. That's two you've told me about, I said. What happened to the third one? The third one was Birgit Svensson, my grandmother said. She lived just across the road from us. One day she started growing feathers all over her body. Within a month she had turned into a large white chicken. Her parents kept her for years in a pen in the garden. She even laid eggs. What colour eggs? I said. Brown ones, my grandmother said. Biggest eggs I've ever seen in my life. Her mother made omelettes out of them. Delicious they were. I gazed up at my grandmother, who sat there like some ancient queen on her throne. Her eyes were misty grey, and they seemed to be looking at something many miles away. The cigar was the only real thing about her at the moment, and the smoke it made billowed round her head in blue clouds. But the little girl who became a chicken didn't disappear, I said. No, not Birgit. She lived on for many years, laying her brown eggs. You said all of them disappeared. I made a mistake, my grandmother said. I'm getting old. I can't remember everything. What happened to the fourth child? I asked. The fourth child was a boy called Harold, my grandmother said. One morning his skin went all greyish yellow. Then it became hard and crackly like the shell of a nut. By evening the boy had turned to stone. Stone, I said. You mean real stone? Granite, she said, and I'll take you to see him if you like. They still keep him in the house. He stands in a hall, a little stone statue. Visitors lean their umbrellas up against him. There he is. Poor Harold. Although I was very young, I was not prepared to believe everything my grandmother told me, and yet she spoke with such conviction, with such utter seriousness, and with never a smile on her face or a twinkle in her eye, that I found myself beginning to wonder. Go on, grandmother, I said. You told me there were 5 altogether. What happened to the last one? Would you like a puff of my cigar? She said. I'm only 7, Grandmamma. I don't care what age you are, she said. You'll never catch a cold if you smoke cigars. That's wrong, everybody. That's wrong. Don't. What about number 5, Grandmamma? Number 5, she said, chewing the end of her cigar, as though it were a delicious asparagus, was rather an interesting case. A 9-year-old boy called Leif was summer holidaying with his family on the fjord, and the whole family were picnicking and swimming off some rocks on one of those islands. Young Leif dived into the water, and his father, who was watching him, noticed that he stayed under for an unusually long time. When he came to the surface at last, he wasn't Leif anymore. What was he, Grandmamma? He was a porpoise. He wasn't. He couldn't have been. He was a lovely young porpoise, she said, as friendly as she could. Grandmamma, I said. Yes, my darling. Did he really and truly turn into a porpoise? Absolutely, she said. I knew his mother well. She told me all about it. She told me how Leif the porpoise stayed with them all that afternoon, giving his brothers and sisters rides on his back. They had a wonderful time. Then he waved a flipper at them and swam away, never to be seen again. But, Grandmamma, I said, how did they know that the porpoise was actually Leif? He talked to them, my grandmother said. He laughed and joked with them all the time he was giving them rides. But wasn't there a tremendous fuss when this happened? I asked. Well, not much, my grandmother said. You must remember that here in Norway we are used to that sort of thing. There are witches everywhere. There's probably one living in our street this very moment. It's time you went to bed." "A witch wouldn't come through my window in the night, would she?" I asked, quaking a little bit. "No," my grandmother said. "A witch will never do silly things like climbing up drain pipes or breaking into people's houses. You'll be quite safe in your bed. Come along, I'll tuck you in." Right, next chapter. How to recognize a witch. The next evening, after my grandmother had given me my bath, she took me once again into the living room for another story. "Tonight," the old woman said, "I am going to tell you how to recognize a witch when you see one." "Can you always be sure?" I asked. "No," she said, "you cannot, and that's the trouble, but you can make a pretty good guess." She dropped cigar ash all over her lap, and I hoped she wasn't going to catch on fire before she told me how to recognize a witch. "In the first place," she said, "a real witch is certain always to be wearing gloves when you meet her." "Surely not always," I said. "What about in the summer when it's hot?" "Even in the summer," my grandmother said. "She has to. Do you want to know why?" "Why?" I said. "Because she doesn't have fingernails. Instead of fingernails, she has thin, curvy claws like a cat, and she wears the gloves to hide them. Mind you, lots of very respectable women wear gloves, especially in winter, so this doesn't help you very much." "Mama used to wear gloves," I said. "Not in the house," my grandmother said. "Witches wear gloves even in the house. They only take them off when they go to bed." "How do you know all this, Grandmama?" "Don't interrupt," she said. "Just take it all in. The second thing to remember is that a real witch is always bold." "Bold?" I said. "Bold as a boiled egg," my grandmother said. I was shocked. There was something indecent about a bold woman. "Why are they bold, Grandmama?" "Don't ask me why," she snapped, "but you can take it from me that not a single hair grows on a witch's head." "How horrid!" "Disgusting," my grandmother said. If she's bold, she'll be easy to spot," I said. "Not at all," my grandmother said. "A real witch always wears a wig to hide her boldness. She wears a first-class wig, and it's almost impossible to tell a real first-class wig from ordinary hair, unless you give it a pull to see if it comes off." "Then that's what I'll have to do," I said. "Don't be foolish," my grandmother said. "You can't go round pulling at the hair of every lady you meet, even if she is wearing gloves. Just you try it and see what happens." "So that doesn't help much either," I said. "None of these things is any good on its own," my grandmother said. "It's only when you put them all together that they begin to make a little sense. Mind you," my grandmother went on, "these wigs do cause a rather serious problem.